Hello, welcome back to my haunted library. It's Regina. So I have a few things going on today that I think are pretty exciting. So number one is I'm doing the drawing for the giveaway. So I'm going to draw two names and the winner will get a prize package with the Regina's Haunted Library pillow, the Batilda swag, the books that I mentioned before, which are Stage Fright and my book, Black Magic, and maybe a few other surprises. So I know you're anxious to get to the giveaway winners to see if you won, so we're going to cut to that right now. All right, so congratulations to the two winners. In order to claim your prize, please contact me via email at reginashauntedlibrary@gmail.com, no apostrophe, and we will set up how to get your prize to you as soon as possible. So thanks again for entering, and let's just move on to the next thing, which is I actually got to the mailbox before Batilda today. Finally. Took me forever to open this one. Okay, what is this? A book. Ooh. All right, this is a book the author sent me called All the Tommies in the World, a Zombie Thriller by Javier? I don't know how to pronounce his first name. Gombinski. Wow. Oh, I know about this because he sent me an email. It's about, well, let's just read the back. The premise did sound really cool. They know something we don't. For horror YouTubers, Lilith and Nate, this is hitting a little close to home, and I love it, I have to say. Zombie movies are escapist fantasies. So when a real zombie uprising in the streets of New Southport is quickly thwarted, they know those familiar-looking ghouls are hiding somewhere. And then it goes on. All right, I think this is a novel, not short stories. It looks kind of long, but it looks pretty good. I like the premise already. Okay. Now, I have to say, people do contact me every once in a while asking me to review their books, even though I don't have a very big platform. And as an author myself, I get it. But lately, I've only been accepting physical copies of books because I already have so many Kindle books that people have sent me, and I feel really bad because I've started reading them, just to let you know. I'm finishing one book and then I'm going to read one of those indie books, but it just gets to be, if I don't see the physical copy, out of sight, out of mind. It gets stuck on my Kindle, and I hate to say it, but I do kind of forget about it because I just have so many books and I'm reading all over the place. So I love to read indie books. If you have a physical copy, feel free to send me one. So I'm going to actually, because this is very prominent now, put this on my desk so I won't forget it. So thank you to the author for sending this to me, and I'm really sorry. I'm pretty sure I mispronounced your first name. Okay, so moving on. I'm very excited to bring today the first episode of a new series, Rock and Roll Horror. I've been talking about this for probably over a year and never got around to it. And now I finally put together a little intro, and I'm going to try to do this series throughout the summer. I don't know if I'll do it every week, but maybe every couple of weeks. Or if I get ambitious, I'll do it every week. So I'm going to be looking at a new rock and roll themed horror book, fiction, nonfiction, and also some films. So this is going to be the summer project, and I hope you tune into it. So to kick it off, let's just cue the intro. Okay. So the book I chose to kick the whole thing off, and as you can see, I took a lot of notes, is called Season of the Witch, which was one of my favorite songs of all time by Donovan. Season of the Witch, How the Occult Saved Rock and Roll by Peter Bebergal. I cannot pronounce anyone's names today. Bebergal. Maybe if I say it really fast, it'll work out. Bebergal writes widely on the speculative and slightly fringe. I have to say, this is really well written. I feel like I'm reading the work of like an old-time journalist, meaning the types of journalists that used to write for Rolling Stone. I'm not saying they still don't, but maybe I haven't read a Rolling Stone in a while. But I just remember back in the day, I had a subscription to Rolling Stone magazine, and I have since let that lapse, but the articles were always really, really well written. But anyway, his essays and reviews have appeared in New Yorker, the Times Literary Supplement, Boing Boing, The Believer, and The Quietus. He is the author of Too Much to Dream, A Psychedelic American Boyhood and the Faith Between Us, A Jew and a Catholic Search for the Meaning of God. That's an interesting concept. Okay, he studied religion and culture at Harvard Divinity School and lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So that's an impressive background. And I did notice that he has a lot of knowledge about, classical religion and Eastern religion and philosophy and Greek mythology and this type of stuff. So I'm going to go through this. I marked different sections in the book. This is one of those books that I zipped through in like 2 days. There's something about reading a book that really interests me that I'm just like, yes. Now, I love rock and roll, I have to say. I mean, I'm dressed kind of conservatively, but I am a rock chick at heart. In fact, just to prove it, I'm drinking a non-alcoholic beer. So if that gives you any indication of my dedication to the world of rock. So I just drank this up. I loved it. All right, so it starts with... he breaks it down into different sections. We are all initiatives now, which is the introduction, and it gets into the, like, what was that thing that became rock and roll that was the devil's music in a way. And of course it starts with American blues, and he brings it even further than that or before that to African culture, and then kind of course, starts where most people, I think, would start the history of rock and roll, would be at the crossroads with Robert Johnson, selling his soul to the devil, as the myth goes. But according to this author, and I was a little disappointed to read this, because I've so, I guess, invested in the myth, is that it was actually someone else, Jim Johnson. But we're just going to pretend that it is Robert Johnson, because I think that's really kind of how a myth goes, is that it might not be the truth, but it becomes the truth when the culture has embraced it as the truth, if that makes sense. So even though it was not, according to him, not the actual Robert Johnson, but another musician who claimed to have sold his soul. But anyway, Robert Johnson was not only probably the father of the blues, but the founding member of the 27 Club. So he died very violently. I think he was poisoned, I believe, at age 27. And then, of course, the myths have continued with different rock stars dying at 27. I mean, it's tragic, but we have Jim Morrison, Janis Joplin, in more recent years, Kurt Cobain, Amy Winehouse. I don't know, if I'm forgetting anyone, put them in the comments below, because it's a kind of a macabre idea, but it is pretty fascinating. What probably happens is that when people do a lot of drugs and alcohol, the body kind of gives out at 27. Of course, Kurt Cobain killed himself. But there's this whole thing about Saturn returneth and different myths about occult myths, maybe you think they're true, concerning the age of 27. If you survive it, it's a good thing. Let's just put it that way, especially if you're a rock star. So the blues was always considered the devil's music in that it was of the body. And there's a racist connotation to it too, because there is this kind of like, in the American South, the white, say, Southern Baptist church, and then you would have the black churches, and out of those churches came a lot of this early rock and roll. Well, actually it came from the white church too. If you think about Little Richard and Jerry Lee Lewis, both came from the gospel background and left the church, and were considered sinners. And at one point, Little Richard went back to the church, but there was always that push and pull. Jerry Lee Lewis, who was considered, the killer, and he, infamously married his 13-year-old cousin and all kinds of stuff. He was considered to have lost his soul, that kind of thing. All right, so it starts there, which is appropriate. If you listen to Little Rich, I have Little Richard's first records, and they're incredible. I mean, talk about like chills. It's so powerful. You kind of forget to have heard this stuff at that time. must have just been like, if you see even old films where people are, at these concerts or kids are rolling around and throwing themselves, it has like this effect on the body. And actually he starts, which I thought was really good, with the myth of Dionysus. I guess I should really start there before we even get to the crossroads, where, comparing the rock star to Dionysus. If you have ever read the Greek play of the Bacchae, where Dionysus has this group of maenads, these women, these cult women who follow him, kind of like groupies. Pentheus is the king, is not happy with this, especially when his mother is one of the lead groupies. So Dionysus tricks him by dressing him up like one of the maenads, which it's only for women, only no men allowed, except for Dionysus, who's a god. But so we have this gender bending thing going on. In fact, in the play, and I remember when I read this in college, we were all kind of giggling because as Dionysus puts women's dress on Pentheus, he starts to become like really into it. And then and actually after reading Thomas Tryan's Harvest Home, it's the same. Thomas Tryan uses that myth as a foundation for his book, which is very clever. But anyway, I'm going off topic. Of course, Pentheus watches this horrible orgy taking place in the woods, and he tries to stop it, and the women attack him and tear him to pieces. In fact, and his mother comes in with his head on a pike, thinking it's a lion's head, because Dionysus has like put his spell on them the way a rock star will put a spell on a crowd of teenagers. And it's a very interesting parallel, and I think it's really true. And I appreciated him starting with that myth, and then kind of uses different Greek myths and different Greek figures in mythology to kind of compare them to certain rock stars. So if you've ever seen the movie The Doors by Oliver Stone, he really does like a Dionysus comparison to Jim Morrison. Jim Morrison even looked like Bacchus with like the wild hair. And I remember in college, my friend of mine had that famous photograph of him shirtless on her dorm room, like a giant poster. And we stood there and would like stare at it, like under the spell of this beautiful man. And I think it's a true thing. I mean, that is part of rock and roll. So chapter 1 is called You Make Me Want to Shout. And it gets into, going from the African roots through the gospel and the blues, and then the early rockers. And of course, Elvis Presley. He was so sexually attractive that girls would go crazy. They would only photograph him from the waist up because of the pelvic movements that would make people swoon. And Elvis was a very good looking man and very talented. I watched that recent documentary about him, which really focuses just on his music, not his personal life. It was really good. In the second chapter, Relax and Flow Downstream, it gets more into some of the other influences like Tolkien's influence on bands, British bands, the early progressive rock bands like Pink Floyd with Syd Barrett. And Dionysus in this way is more like Pan. Pan is more like a child god. The Piper at the Gates of Dawn is an early Pink Floyd record. And it gets into the whole Syd Barrett myth. Syd Barrett was this incredibly creative man who just took way too much acid and just went off the rails. Whenever I read Pan in this book, I kept thinking of the line from the Spinal Tap song, and the children dance to the pipes of Pan. That movie is so great at spoofing all of that type of rock and roll. I'm wondering if someone today, like a young person today, would really even get that movie, and it's so funny. I'm curious. Okay, so rock culture was now inhabited by a romantic soul that looked to the gods of the past. So it talks about, romanticism in the literary sense, individualism, emotional expression. So then he gets into a little bit of the stuff happening with, the decadent school. There starts to be this idea of like UFO culture, psychedelia. Like even when I was a little kid in the late 60s, I remember knowing about psychedelia through television commercials. It was all over. It was in fabrics. Peter Max, we all knew about Peter Max and Yellow Submarine. We had all the Beatles records, and we would look at them for clues and try to play them backwards and all that kind of stuff. It was pretty cool. All right, so what else? That gets into the LSD influence in the late 60s. The occult imagination, madness. He does write a lot about Madame Blavatsky's Theosophical Society and the Golden Dawn, these different occult groups. Now you have to remember that before there was the internet, and I do remember this quite well, all of your culture came through like 3 channels on the TV set, the radio, of course print media, and records, buying records in record stores. Like when George Harrison played with Ravi Shankar, and my husband saw that concert. I'm very, very jealous. That was a major thing of introducing Indian music to an American audience, let's say, or a Western audience. Like so that was like major. And then people started listening to it. And then it started infiltrating into rock culture. Not saying that is a cult, but it gets into like the Eastern mysticism influence. So there was a lot going on, basically. Beatles album. Now, of course, we had a copy of Sgt. Pepper, and that album is great. We would listen to it constantly. In fact, I think we listened to that record. I was really little when it came out, but my older sister had that record, and we listened to it for the next 10 years. And I knew all the songs, and we would sing them and make up plays about the songs, like She's Leaving Home. I remember acting that song out. And I think it's about a girl becoming a prostitute. Of course, we didn't know that at the time. But I really remember my older sister, when I was about 6 years old, she sat me down and explained to me all the symbolism in the album cover. I didn't know who Aleister Crowley was at the time, of course, but he figures a lot in this book. He probably would be considered like the founding father of the occult in a way. I mean, at least in modern times. He writes here at the end of this chapter, like all great myths, the occult story of rock involved a descent into the underworld, a transformation and an ascent. Compares it to Orpheus's journey. The devil rides out. Okay, so now it gets into a little more of what we would consider like the darkness. He writes about Kenneth Anger a lot. Now, I only knew Kenneth Anger through this book that, I'm not saying we stole it from the library, but somehow a library book ended up in our house called Hollywood Babylon. I still have a copy of it. And that was a really shocking book. It was the first time I had ever seen a picture of the Black Dahlia corpse. And it had all kinds of nasty stories in it. And Kenneth Anger, who was a filmmaker, Scorpio Rising, Lucifer Rising, these very outre art films, he was part of this whole occult movement. In fact, the Process Church is mentioned a lot. So Kenneth Anger was friends with Mick Jagger, who definitely personifies that Dionysian figure, gender bending. The kids think they invented this stuff today. This was happening in rock and roll for a long time. People like Mick Jagger, there was that famous picture, I forget the movie, if I remember it, I'll put it here. Because he has a very feminine face, and at the time with the big lips, there's a photograph of a movie he was in with like wearing women's makeup, which was at that time shocking. Of course, then we get into David Bowie, who really took it to the next level. But this kind of stuff goes back to Dionysus, or even in Norse mythology, the god Loki, who is gender fluid. He would switch from male to female in a heartbeat and wouldn't lose any of his power. But at this time, that kind of stuff was still pretty shocking. Okay, there's a lot of section in this book about Jimmy Page and his obsession with Aleister Crowley. He even lived in his house for a while. He bought a bunch of his manuscripts, and lived on his home on the shore of Loch Ness, a mansion rumored to be haunted by the spirits the dark magician had conjured. Wow, I bet. I read a book, like a biography about Aleister Crowley a while ago, and it was very interesting. He really went off the rails, but his early life was interesting. He was an alpine mountaineer. He did a lot of interesting things. Led Zeppelin songs are based on, of course, Tolkien mythology, Norse mythology, like the Immigrant Song, which is probably my favorite Zeppelin song. I'm not a huge Zeppelin fan, but I do love some of their songs. Okay, here we go. Timothy Leary, who of course introduced LSD to the popular culture. Timothy Leary once remarked that he believed his own attempt to make the exploration of consciousness via drugs an inalienable right was an extension of Crowley's "Do What Thou Wilt." So it was even, he mentions in here, it was written on a Zeppelin album, but you had to hold it up to the light to see it. This idea of do whatever you want. This might seem not such a major concept these days, but at that time, when people were expected to kind of follow a certain script according to their gender type, women were expected to, you didn't question it. You're going to get married and have kids and be a housewife or whatever. And men, you're going to go to work and you're going to get this job, even if you hate it. You're just going to do it. This idea of, well, you could just maybe not do that and do what you want was a kind of a mind-blowing idea. And a dangerous one in a lot of ways, because then it's ripping the fabric of a society that's been built over thousands of years. I'm not saying that that's a bad thing necessarily, but everything has consequences. And now I think people just are really confused about what they want. Do what thou wilt, yeah, but what to do. And this is part of the myth. It gets into like the idea that, okay, you can do what thou wilt and you can make a pact with Satan, but at some point in this Faustian bargain, the devil has to get his due. So we see Zeppelin kind of spinning into some darkness. In 1975, Robert Plant was almost killed in a car accident. 2 years later, his son died from a virus. And 3 years later, their beloved but out of control drummer, John Bonham, died of a drug overdose. So things kind of spun out of control. I mean, you see that. I mean, you could say, well, some of this is just life, but you see some musicians, great artists or people that have this kind of incredible charisma then having a great fall. I mean, you even see that now in although I wouldn't say he's a great artist. I'm not exactly a fan. I find him interesting, but I was thinking of Marilyn Manson, who's now having his own troubles. Maybe some of his karma's coming back at him. I don't know. I don't know what to believe. I just know what I read in the Daily Mail. But anyway, this part I found really interesting. It gets into Black Sabbath. Of course, that is such a blatant reference to the occult. So then it gets into this really interesting idea of the tritone chord, or the devil's interval, which is a chord that you hear in metal rock, starting with Black Sabbath. And there's a whole thing about that. It's very interesting how it was taken from classical music, like the Mephisto waltzes. There you go. Oh, he does mention briefly a book called Lords of Chaos, which is specifically about metal, like death metal music or black metal. I will do a review of that book. I have that book and I really like it. So I plan on including that in this series if you want to stick around for that. Black Sabbath represents the most perfect example of how occult manifests in rock and roll culture. Again, it wasn't hidden. That was just part of the act. Alice Cooper kind of took that into a more theatrical direction, and then so did Kiss. Honestly, even when I was a little kid, I thought of Alice Cooper as kind of silly. I remember Welcome to My Nightmare, and it was fun in the same way that creature features, television creature features were fun, but it didn't exactly scare me. Same with Kiss. I was never a fan of Kiss, and that there's a reason for that. My older brother played the Kiss Live album incessantly one summer. It was like a double album. I've hated Kiss ever since because it was horrible. He would play his guitar in his bedroom along and play it really loud. And then each of the members of Kiss had their own solo record. The drummer had his own record. just drums, the whole record, and he would play those over and over again. He was definitely a member of the Kiss army. I've always hated Kiss. Plus, they kind of suck. Let's just be honest. Just saying. I do like their costumes, though. I will give them that. The costumes are really cool. So this book is arranged more thematically than in like a chronological history. Because chapter 4, he gets into the Tree of Life. He talks about like the rock star as shaman, like Arthur Brown with his fire headdress. Well, then he does a lot of Bowie. Bowie, bisexuality and binary sense of self. Bowie was like this perfect, androgynous, beautiful creature. And Ziggy Stardust, of course, that album is a masterpiece. And that was one of our favorite records in the 70s growing up. Again, a whole story was told. Bowie was very theatrical. So he created these different characters, and of course in each one of his manifestations he would change his look. And this book gets into this. He kind of turns, when he becomes the Thin White Duke, he kind of compares him to like this Nazi. He mentions here, I guess Cameron Crowe did a story on Bowie, and by that time Bowie was so paranoid with cocaine he was convinced Jimmy Page was trying to put a curse on him, and that witches were set out to steal his semen. Well, you never know with witches. We've got to keep Matilda on a tight leash. Oh, this is interesting. It gets into the different kinds of musical technology, the dream machine. It's like the early synthesizers. I'm wondering if this was the same thing that was used in Garrett Boatman's Stage Fright. I think it might be. I think he might even call it a dream machine. Which is one of the books in the giveaway. So he writes about the goth movement, like in music. Goth cannot be compared to heavy metal's upside-down pentagrams and brandishing of Aleister Crowley. Instead, goth rock inhabits a mood, just as the original literary genre did. Goth's aesthetic is more like the tragic beauty of the Victorian era's Memento Mori. It gets into space rock with Hawkwind and Sun Ra. So it gets into a lot of like electronic music. Then it goes into the whole thing with the Yes albums, the Roger Dean artwork. I mean, I do remember in high school being at a party where we were all sitting around kind of maybe a little bit stoned, to admit, talking about all of the different symbolisms on the Yes album. All right, then it gets into King Crimson, which I love that band. Prog rock, of course, I love the artwork of H.R. Giger on the Emerson, Lake and Palmer records. Different mythology was a big part of prog rock, and Arthurian legends and Tolkien and Norse mythology, and sometimes to humorous degrees, which again Spinal Tap really spoofed in like their Stonehenge song. And I underlined this because I thought it was just an interesting statement. Sometimes it was believed the musicians themselves were just vessels, often unaware they were being used to telegraph designs beyond themselves. I was disappointed that he didn't mention Patti Smith, who definitely has a shaman type of presence, especially if you've ever seen one of her live shows. I mean, this is a really good book, but he doesn't really mention a lot of the female rock stars. He doesn't even mention Stevie Nicks, which is one of my probably major criticisms of this book. Now we kind of know Stevie Nicks as like the good fairy, the fairy godmother, but in the 70s, even though Fleetwood Mac was really popular, real pop music, top 40 kind of stuff, this whole aura about her being a witch really was part of the mystique of that band. I mean, I know I was into it. So prog rock was wiped out seemingly overnight by punk and new wave. I loved prog rock, but by the time I got to college, it wasn't cool. It was all punk. It was all punk and new wave. And the only people listening to prog rock or had like even a prog rock vibe were like those guys who would hang out at the student commons who were in their 30s with a beard and wearing like a unicorn t-shirt. They were trying to like get with the freshman girls or whatever. They weren't the cool guys. The cool guys had punk haircuts and were wearing leather jackets by the time I got into college. And then he kind of winds down with the occult in today's music. I love here near the end where he really eviscerates Madonna's Super Bowl performance, where she used all these different occult images, but not connected to any kind of real meaning, just kind of flashing, maybe just for shock value. On the face of it, it was pure pop spectacle, full of color and drama, signifying Madonna's ego and little more. Ending on this note with Madonna, I think is really good. That was like the end of rock and roll. And it just became all about pop music, and you didn't really have to be a good musician. It was all about the image, which is, in a way, is satanic in the Anton LaVey way, where it's all about just me and my selfishness and money and image, and it's not connected to anything real. I mean, at least Jimmy Page lived in Crawley's house and read all his manuscripts and got into it. I don't think Madonna would even know what any of that is. I know she's into Kabbalah or whatever, but it just always seems like it's about her. It's not about mysticism or trying to channel some greater knowledge from the beyond or from ancient history. I'm not a Madonna fan, in case you haven't noticed. So if you stuck around this long, thank you. And let me know if you've read Season of the Witch. If you are an expert on rock and roll and I've got anything wrong in my presentation, please let me know. I'm always willing to learn new things about this style of music that I absolutely adore. So if you have any suggestions for rock and roll horror books, fiction or nonfiction, please mention them in the comments below. I would love to hear your thoughts. So that's all I have for today. Thanks for stopping by my haunted library, and I'll see you soon. Bye.